Good afternoon. My name is Chris Butler. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manchester, and today I'm going to be presenting to you some of my research on the link between policy non-responsiveness and motivated reasoning. So I'm really interested in the puzzle of non-responsiveness, as in why are governments sometimes responsive on salient issues but other times not? So in recent years, there's been a wealth of studies on policy responsiveness, and they've tended to find that governments are broadly responsive to voters' preferences, whether that's preferences for particular actions, whether that's the issues that are most important to voters and governments responding with greater spending or attention in those policy areas, or even studies that have tried to kind of aggregate voters' preferences and government outputs onto a kind of single left-right policy axis. All these different studies have found that governments are broadly responsive to voters' preferences. And yet we can all think of examples of governments pursuing unpopular policies on salient issues. And kind of existing scholarship and policy responsiveness has focused on whether there are differences in the likelihood of responsiveness between different types of countries with different types of institutions, or even between different governments, so whether more or less popular governments are more likely to be responsive. But the only kind of focus on why governments might be responsive on some issues but not on others has tended to focus on the salience of those issues to voters, i.e. the thesis that governments are more likely to be responsive to voters on issues which are of greater importance to voters. So as I see it, there are two likely explanations for why governments are not always responsive on salient issues. The first is that governments prioritise goals other than office, other than just being responsive to voters. The second, which is the one I'm going to focus on today, is actually that political decision makers can't anticipate the electoral reaction to their decisions. The expectation of policy responsiveness is well described by Stimson et al.'s theory of the rational anticipation mechanism, which holds that we expect that governments and other elected officials want to be re-elected, and therefore they're always going to be alert to voters' preferences and they're going to respond to voters' preferences in their actions. But I think the really key element in this chain, in this rational anticipation mechanism, is the perceived value of a decision in electoral terms to decision makers themselves. It's how they interpret how voters' preferences, how voters are going to respond to a decision, and how that's going to affect their likelihood of re-election. But this is kind of the starting expectation of the theory of policy responsiveness, the idea, as in the quote at the bottom of the slide, that elected officials are always alert to voters' preferences and always willing to kind of respond in their actions. So I'm a little sceptical of this process of rational anticipation occurring, particularly because of the importance of decision makers' perceptions on interpreting information about voters' preferences and how that affects their likelihood of enacting responsive or non-responsive policies. If it's the case that politicians have existing policy preferences, then it's quite likely and quite probable that they will make use of motivated reasoning when interpreting information on the likely electoral effects of those policies. We know that the way in which people process information is to try to reconfirm their existing preferences. And we know that when opinions on something are strongly held, then it's more likely that humans will use what Kahneman called System 1 thinking, i.e. quickly forming judgments around the issue and failing to deliberate. Similar to Simon's concept of selective perception, the more strongly an opinion is held, the more likely cognitive processes are to be biased, that humans will recall evidence that validates their existing opinions. So if politicians believe in some policy solutions, that they have a value on the utility of those policies being enacted, then this is likely to kind of bias their processing of information about the likely electoral effects of those decisions. So to test the hypothesis that actually motivated reasoning affects political decision makers' ability to kind of accurately anticipate the likely electoral reaction of voters. Looked at 3 cases of electorally damaging decisions from the UK. New Labour are not introducing transitional controls on the rights of Eastern European EU citizens to access UK labour markets that led to a rise in immigration in the noughties. Looked at the Conservatives' controversial NHS reforms in 2012 and the Liberal Democrats' U-turn on tuition fees in 2010. And why I wanted to kind of look at observational data is because there is some existing literature, particularly using experiments on political actors to try and understand whether motivated reasoning affects their perception of electoral incentives. But sometimes it can be hard with experiments to kind of recreate real life conditions and understand how people will react in a real life setting. So, for example, there was a great Danish study that looked at how Danish politicians responded to information, giving them opinion poll data on policies they liked, which actually found that they rejected opinion poll data that didn't conform to their existing preferences. But as the authors acknowledged, you couldn't rule out the possibility that decision makers were engaged in Bayesian reasoning and actually just incorporating the information presented to them as part of the experiment on top of all their existing information. So I wanted to use some kind of observational data to understand in a kind of real life setting how perceptions about electoral reactions actually affected decision making. So I've conducted 24 interviews with politicians and advisors involved in the decision-making process. I've corroborated that with other documents, other kind of available accounts of these decisions, but fortunately it's very rare that there have kind of been any disagreements or evidence of buck passing in the interviews. Most participants, those who responded to me at least, were willing to kind of reflect on their motivations on the decision making process. And so the key information I was trying to gather was how aware were decision makers about the potential electoral risks of these decisions when they took them. So for all 3 cases, I found evidence that decision makers prioritised information that reinforced their existing policy preferences and dismissed evidence that contradicted it about the likely electoral reaction to those decisions. So in this case, the Liberal Democrats and tuition fees, it's sometimes forgotten that senior Liberal Democrat MPs tried to drop their party's opposition to tuition fees before the 2010 election. They saw abolishing tuition fees as a regressive use of kind of taxation. And you can kind of see from these quotes and some of those involved in the decision, they kind of convinced themselves, well, it wouldn't really be that bad. People will respond to the outcomes data. They also convinced themselves that as Tony Blair's government had performed a U-turn on tuition fees but gone on to win a 3rd term, that it wouldn't really affect their electoral support in the same way. Even though the Liberal Democrats had been the main beneficiaries in university constituencies of the Blair government's U-turn. And it's very much the case that students and people working in higher education were much more kind of critical component of the Liberal Democrats' electoral coalition in 2010 than they had been of New Labour's electoral coalition in the early noughties. The Conservatives' 2012 NHS reforms were very much the brainchild of the Conservative Secretary of State for Health, Andrew Lansley, and he was very convinced in the rightness, the utility of these reforms. And having kind of spoken to some GPs at various policy conferences, he was absolutely convinced that GPs would support the reforms and that public opinion would just support the GPs. And because he'd spoken to some GPs, there was no need to do any formal consultation with groups representing NHS workers. And unfortunately that wasn't the case. GPs that turn up to policy conferences are perhaps not representative of the wider body of healthcare professionals. And they also kind of failed to anticipate any potential opposition to encouraging competition and the use of the private sector in delivering NHS services. They kind of failed to spot that New Labour had stopped using legislation to enact NHS reforms because having had such a parliamentary rebellion over the introduction of foundation hospitals in 2003, but Lansley's team mistakenly took this as evidence that there wasn't really any kind of disagreement over the broad direction of healthcare reform policy. In the case of New Labour and immigration, New Labour were very keen on economic immigration as a way of growing tax revenues in order to fund investment in public services. That's arguably the kind of ultimate policy priority of New Labour. And they kind of convinced themselves that public concern about immigration could be addressed by demonstrating competence in the asylum system. And they kind of refused, even though they were getting information from focus groups of voters who were concerned about immigration, they refused to really kind of tackle that issue in itself head on. So in all three cases, there was evidence available to decision makers that there might be electoral risks from these decisions, whether it's discussions around immigration focus groups that New Labour were privy to, or polling information so that Liberal Democrats knew that opposition to tuition fees was one of their most popular policies, and the Conservatives knew that the concept of NHS reform was unpopular among voters. So in all three cases, I found evidence that decision makers prioritised information which reinforced their existing preferences and dismissed evidence which contradicted those preferences. So this is very much in line with motivated reasoning, so it supports the hypothesis that actually politicians' existing preferences lead to motivated reasoning, and this affects their judgment of likely electoral reactions. What's also noteworthy is that there weren't kind of any mechanisms within the UK decision-making process to adjust for the fact that certain decision makers were relying on motivated reasoning. This might be something that's unique to the UK system of governance and kind of warrants further investigation to understand why. But for me, the most kind of important finding from this is that there is a lot of literature in democratic theory and theories of policy responsiveness that's very much kind of grounded in rational choice expectations. So it expects that elected officials will want to seek re-election, and therefore they will consider voters' views when taking decisions, and this is therefore likely to lead to governments being responsive to voters. But what I've highlighted in red is what I see as the key point in the chain of this mechanism of rational anticipation. It's politicians' kind of perceptions of what the electoral implications of a decision are. And therefore, for me, the likelihood of responsiveness is dependent on what affects politicians' perceptions, which is actually their existing policy preferences. So rather than kind of expecting that responsiveness is dependent on the salience of an issue to voters, I would argue that responsiveness is actually more likely to be dependent on the importance of an issue to decision makers themselves. So that's kind of a brief summary of my research in this area. I have got a paper that I'm willing to share with people. I very much look forward to your comments and feedback. Thank you for listening.